So when you open up the Gospel of John to chapter 5, you're not just getting another miracle story. Not at all. This is the spark that lights an absolute firestorm. We are about to witness the beginning of a formal showdown, a trial that really sets the stage for everything to come. At its heart, this chapter plays out just like a courtroom drama. Seriously, it all kicks off with one simple act of healing, but man, it spirals fast into two life-threatening accusations. What follows is nothing short of a trial for the ages, with Jesus himself on the stand. The stakes, they literally couldn't be any higher.
So, where does this whole thing begin? Well, we're in Jerusalem, at the Pool of Bethesda. I want you to just picture a place crowded with the sick, the suffering, a scene of just pure, raw desperation. And it's right here, in this spot, that a single act of mercy becomes the catalyst for a massive, massive conflict.
Okay, so Jesus heals a man who's been paralyzed for decades. I mean, it's a straight-up miracle. But then he tells him, get up, take your bed, and walk. And here's the rub. It's the Sabbath. Now, for the religious leaders, both the healing itself and telling the guy to carry his mat counted as work, which was a huge violation of sacred law. This wasn't just some minor infraction, you know? The Sabbath was a cornerstone of their entire identity and religious authority. To challenge it was to challenge them, directly.
And this is where things just escalate, and I mean fast. What starts as a complaint about a religious rule quickly blows up into charges that carry the death penalty.
So the prosecution builds its case in 3 clear steps. As you can see, it starts with the healing. That's breaking the Sabbath. Then there's the command to carry the mat, also considered work. But it's Jesus' defense that leads to the final and most explosive charge. When they confront him, he says, "My Father is always at his work, and I too am working." And boom, suddenly the accusation isn't about the Sabbath anymore, it's about blasphemy.
This right here, this is the moment the entire trial pivots. By calling God his own Father, he was, in their minds, claiming to be equal with God. This was no longer about breaking a rule. This was a capital offense. The trial just shifted from being about religious law to being about divine identity and authority.
So, facing these deadly accusations, how does Jesus respond? He doesn't back down for a second. Instead, he mounts his defense, but he does it in this really fascinating way. He starts calling a series of witnesses to testify for him.
Now, Jesus anticipates their legal objection, right? He knows they're thinking, a person can't testify on their own behalf. So he doesn't just call one witness, or even 2, he calls 5 distinct witnesses to back up his claims and his authority.
Let's just look at this witness list for a second. First up, John the Baptist, a prophet they all respected. Then he points to his works, the miracles themselves, as undeniable proof. He even says the Father himself is testifying through these works. And then crucially, he points to the scriptures, their own holy books, as a key witness. And only then, with the weight of all these others, does he include his own testimony.
But just when you think the defense has presented its whole case, Jesus delivers the trial's climax. And it is a stunning reversal that turns the prosecution's entire argument completely upside down.
I mean, this is the knockout blow. He tells them he doesn't even need to accuse them. The very person they hold up as their ultimate authority, their source of hope and law, Moses, he is the one who will accuse them. The irony is just staggering.
This slide really breaks down the core of the conflict. You see, they believed studying the scriptures was the path to eternal life, but Jesus says you're reading the right books, but you're missing the entire point. They're all testifying about me. They claimed Moses as their ultimate authority, but Jesus comes back with, if you really believed Moses, you would believe me. They were honoring the words on the page, but completely missing the person the words were pointing to.
Now, this trial doesn't just end with a verdict. In the middle of his defense, Jesus introduces this profound, kind of mind-bending concept about judgment itself. He starts talking about life, death, and judgment in a way that just collapses the distance between the future and the present. Theologians have a big fancy name for this: inaugurated eschatology. But don't let the term scare you off. The idea is actually pretty simple. Jesus is saying that the end times, the final judgment, the promise of eternal life, it isn't just some far-off event we're all waiting for. No, the future has already started to break into our present. And he makes this distinction himself. Just notice the very specific language he uses. He says a time is coming, and now is, for the spiritually dead to hear his voice and live. That's happening right now.
But he also says a time is coming when everyone in their graves will physically rise for a final judgment. So there's a judgment happening now, spiritually, and one that will happen later, physically.
So what's the crucial point in all this? It's this. According to what Jesus is teaching in this chapter, the final verdict isn't something you just have to wait for. It's actually being decided in the present. A person's response to him, right here and now, is what determines their eternal destiny. The future is literally being shaped by the choices we make today.
And that brings us to the end of this incredible trial, but it leaves us with this really provocative question at the heart of the whole chapter. If the authority you staked your entire life on turned out to be the very one pointing to your failure, what would you have to fundamentally reconsider about everything you believe?